welcome to Diversitas, a show at the intersection of diversity, business, and culture. My name is Michael Bowman, and today we are here with a very good friend of mine, an entrepreneur, a man about town, Mr. Craig Williams. Mr. Williams is the principal of at least two businesses, although he has a growing empire. I would venture to say that his principal business is Pride Enterprises, which is a general construction management firm. And his second business, which he started recently, or more recently, I should say, is American Power, which is an electrical supply firm. Welcome, Mr. Williams.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
I am so happy that you were able to join us on this adventure. You know, I kind of, as I was saying to you, kind of off air, we surprised you with this. I had not talked to you about this podcast, so it is a testament to our friendship that you took this invite, you accepted this invite without knowing anything about it. I really
I trust you. I trust you.
Well, I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. So you are, as I said in our intro, you are an entrepreneur, and your principal business is Pride. How long have you been with Pride? How long has Pride been in existence?
Pride Enterprises has a 30-year history. Pride was founded in '96, but ultimately acquired the parent company, which predated Pride by about 10 years.
So you have been in construction for 40 years, is that?
Roughly 30 years, about
Okay.
30 years, a little more than 30.
Okay. So was your father always in construction?
Not always. He was in corporate America for a large part of his career, resulting from an acquisition by a foreign national firm. He exited the corporate world and found himself at a crossroads, and an opportunity to pursue an entrepreneurial venture presented itself, and that ultimately led to an opportunity to become a general contractor.
So was he a handy person? Like, if I worked at a big firm and then I didn't work at a big firm. It wasn't my first inclination to start a construction firm. So how did that happen?
My father was an artist by training, but also very much a jack of all trades. I mean, he was instrumental in raising, family homes, and did quite a bit of renovations around our house. So he did have a lot of that natural inclination, but wasn't trained in construction or engineering. But I think his background in corporate America really gave him a leg up in terms of the mindset and thought process to launch a business successfully.
So I don't think I've ever told you this. My father had a little construction firm, a little contracting firm. It was called Right Way General Contracting, and he owned it with his brother. And so I was probably in my, between 8 and 12. And so, he was fairly handy, I suppose. And so he tried to get me out there on one of these jobs. Man, I was like, you got to be kidding me. Okay.
Sent you straight to law school.
That's when I made the decision. I'm like, there's no way I'm doing this. So when you were growing up, did you, because of him, did you get exposure to that, and that kind of piqued your interest in this kind of business?
Definitely. In fact, I come from a family of contractors. I have other relatives that have been in the industry for quite some time. So my summer jobs were working in construction. Started off as a painter, then I became a carpenter on a roofing crew, and eventually it became a foundation, kind of unbeknownst to me, for a career. And as some of the other interests that I had peeled away or took a back seat, it was apparent that a career in construction was a real opportunity for me.
Did you go, did you go into construction straight out of college, or did you do something else before you got into construction?
Straight out of college, for all intents and purposes. The summer jobs began when I was in college. I did take a circuitous route through undergrad. So there were a number of years that I was working in construction before I returned to school to finish up my degree.
Right.
So construction was a very important component of my transition to the professional level.
So, so you get into construction. I'm assuming you get into it with your father or with some family members. Was your father, I believe that you told me at some point that your father was in 8A, is that right?
Yes, he did participate in the 8A program.
For the uninitiated, what is 8A?
The 8A program is a federal initiative that's sponsored by the Small Business Administration. It is directed at economically challenged individuals. Its origins were an effort to address disparity along racial lines. So it was and remains a diversity initiative to a large extent, but the concept of diversity has been expanded. So it's not exclusive for Black and brown people. And in fact, many of the larger participants are not Black and brown people today. But it is a great incubator program for fledgling companies to get access to opportunities on a negotiated basis or on a limited competition basis that really can help a company get its legs under it, build up some financial resources and some experience and know-how that can lead to a long-term proposition.
When you started Pride, did you take Pride through the 8A process?
Pride ultimately did secure 8A status, yes.
How long between the time you started Pride and the time you became 8A?
I think it was 3 years.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And in that 3-year period, did you have any difficulty getting business?
It was challenging, but I was somewhat uniquely prepared to launch a business. Coming from a family of contractors, working in the public space, being very familiar with initiatives like 8A, also HubZone at the time was relevant. I was able to chart a path and had the relationships and resources to launch the business. So it was a little rocky in the beginning. Not everything unfolded as expected. But once an initiative that we got into first before 8A, which was HubZone, I mentioned a moment ago, historically underutilized business zone. Once that got rolling, we were able to secure foundational projects that ultimately put us in a position to qualify for the 8A program.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you did kind of HubZone work first, and then you got into the 8A program.
Yeah, the impetus for starting Pride Enterprises, to launch it in earnest, was the HubZone initiative. It was something that my father's company didn't qualify for. And so I had established a business to do little side projects and things that were, not necessarily attractive for my father's company to do. And then when the HubZone initiative really started to be promoted heavily, it was clear that Pride was an entity that could pursue that effectively. And so that's really when Pride got started.
And so again, for the uninitiated, what is a HubZone initiative?
Again, it stands for historically underutilized business zone.
Okay.
It has been promoted as a strong alternative to the 8A program because it's geographically based. So there are sectors in the United States. So it's divided up into a grid where certain matrix, if the location falls below averages of tax base and employment and other factors, it's designated as a hub zone. And if your business is located there and you hire a certain number of people, a percentage of your staff from hub zones, you can qualify for set aside opportunities. And it's designed to help revitalize depressed areas of the country.
So this question just popped into my head. Um, Pride has always been a commercial construction firm, correct?
Yes.
And was your father's firm a commercial construction firm?
Yes.
Okay. So is there any reason why you've never done residential?
Residential is a slightly different animal. There's differences between public sector work and private sector work, and the differences between those two. Residential is yet another, realm in terms of just how you have to be oriented, the kinds of clients and the kinds of things that you have to manage, or the priorities for that clientele are a little bit different. So, there is housing development on a scale, like the kind of things that Toll Brothers does.
Right.
But then there's private residential work, where you're working on one individual's home. And we were never in a position to scale up to do residential in a larger kind of context. And so there's companies that are built and designed to do residential work, right. And we're not that.
Okay. That's it. I've always wanted to ask that question because I know that it seems to me, particularly now in the market we find ourselves in, that there's always like a real need for that. And I don't understand why we don't have more people kind of in that space doing that work. You have any idea?
Yeah, it's residential work is often not driven by plans and specs. And so, you encounter a lot of different kinds of things in that environment, which, you need to have a certain kind of crew, and then in the commercial space, it's driven by documentation. You can assemble a team. It's a very regulated environment. And even though, again, there's differences between working for a developer or working for an institution, but then working for the federal government, the public sector is highly regulated. There's recourse and the ability to kind of manage situations within a framework. The more you get away from the public sector, the less so that is the case. Mm-hmm. And so there's variations and variables, and the federal space is actually, in my experience, a great environment to establish a business because it is regulated.
Let me ask you this. So, okay, you get into the 8A program. I'm glad you actually brought that up because it's a great segue. You get into the 8A program. And so what kind of work do you start to get through 8A that helps Pride to kind of establish itself?
You get an amazing array of projects. The federal government is the single largest purchaser of everything. And there are many things that only the federal government buys. But to your question, it starts off small because it is a marketing driven initiative. So you have to get out there and meet the clients, pitch your services, win their trust. So it's a slow build, so the initial projects could be a renovation job, just of a very small office, just, a few hundred square feet or something of that nature. But then there are other unique opportunities where, systems are being upgraded, or other kinds of unique scenarios. For example, working for the Department of Defense, working for the Army Corps of Engineers, there were munitions storage units that had to be retrofitted with larger apertures, larger openings, because the munitions had gotten bigger. And so it was a repeat project of cutting out ironclad doors, retrofitting in new, larger ironclad doors, 100 different times. And that's the kind of thing that only the federal government will purchase. But, in the beginning, it's a series of small projects and it builds up. But in our case, because we had hub zone experience before that, we were able to enter the 8A program at a level that's perhaps not typical of most companies that go in.
So a couple of questions. Number one, is there, and it's going back to another comment you made, with the government work, is there less risk for you as a CMGC in doing federal government work than doing kind of the work outside of the federal government?
There is significantly less risk for projects that are under the 8A program because they are negotiated. So, you don't create an initiative to build companies up and then throw them into the lion's den and watch them be devoured. But that is different than the vast majority of federal procurement, which is on a competitive basis. And so when it's a rip and read, where you find out if you were successful or unsuccessful on the day of the bid, he who makes the biggest mistake wins in many cases.
Right.
And so when you're bidding competitively, like the Hub Zone initiative was competitively driven. Most federal procurement is competitively driven.
So it's interesting. There are a couple of questions I have as a result of that. But one is, so how long is a company in the 8A program?
The 10-year is 9 years. I think I heard something where they extended it a year or not, but when I went through the 8A program, it was a 9-year tenure.
And during your 9-year period in 8A, and from a dollar value perspective, what was the largest project you ever did?
I think during the 8A program, the high water mark was a $10 million project.
Okay. And that was a negotiated price, the 10 million?
No. Negotiated projects, I think, cap out in the $5 million range.
Got it.
And then there are competitive 8A set-asides that can be larger than that.
Okay. So once you grow, it sounds like once you grow, they are kind of preparing you for the reality of what happens when you kind of drop out in terms of you having to competitively bid on jobs, et cetera, right?
There is an effort to do that. The attrition rate amongst graduating 8A firms is remarkably high.
Is that right?
Because that negotiated work, it's hard to resist. And if you're a qualified 8A firm, at least the way that it was, in the past and during different administrations and different economic cycles, if you're a qualified 8A firm, you're a really valuable quantity and a solution to a lot of the procurement challenges that government agencies have. And so you can become overly dependent or overly indulgent in that negotiated work. And then that 9 years goes by really fast. And the ability to transition to a competitive posture, it isn't easy. My history is fairly long, and I've been through a variety of different scenarios, working with my father, being a consultant to his company, launching my business, going through Hub Zone, then entering 8A and what have you. And so we've always maintained a competitive posture. We laid the foundation competing for work. And so participating in the 8A program, it was almost like, a less demanding scenario for us. And we never got to the point where we forgot where we came from.
You never got comfortable with that?
No. And that's been a key element that's allowed us to do several things.
So your 9 years runs out, and now you are transitioning, and I'm assuming that you saw the horizon and you started making that transition even before the 9-year horizon. Would that be accurate or no?
Well, circumstance is always a huge factor, right? And so, we graduated from the 8A program in 2010. And as I'm sure you recall, the economic conditions starting in, say, 2007, 2008, when the Obama administration came in, things were very unstable.
Right.
And a lot of businesses struggled and didn't survive that period. And as we were exiting the 8A program, a few things transpired that at the time represented tremendous challenge for us, but ultimately proved to be an invaluable shift that allowed us to navigate that deep recession. With two wars going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Department of Veterans Affairs shifted its focus away from diverse, economically challenged businesses towards veteran-owned companies.
Right.
And that represented a 30% loss of revenue for us. We were deeply entrenched in the Department of Veterans Affairs. That forced us to think outside of the box and form a partnership with a returning veteran from Iraq that ultimately proved central, like critical to our ability to survive and navigate that recession, because at the time, the private sector was flat. The vast majority of the public sector was flat. And one of the few things that right-left politics could agree on is to not repeat the unfortunate history of the Vietnam War,
Right.
and to make sure that there was investment in the VA hospitals.
Right.
And so if the partnership that we were somewhat forced into because of the shift of priority ended up being in the right place at the right time with the right strategy. And that was critical, because those American Reinvestment and Recovery Act projects, many of them took place at the Department of Veterans Affairs in the VAMC hospitals. And we happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Is Pride still doing that kind of work through the VA, with the VA?
Yes, we continue to have that partnership. The company is called Fidelis Design and Construction. We work in a support capacity with them and partner with them on a series of projects.
So that's so, you know, you venture into that, which is, I guess, very fortunate. I would imagine very fortunate for you at the time. But Pride continues to still, even through the recession, try to get work in the other public sector, in the private sector. At some point, you know, post-recession, does Pride begin to pick up steam in those areas?
Yes, fortunately, having come out of the other side of the recession, we started to see activity in the private sector. The major institutions, the anchor institutions, as they're sometimes referred to, started to show the first signs of economic recovery. And so we ventured to reposition Pride from the public sector to the private sector, initially pursuing clients like the University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, Drexel, to name a few, which is where we were able to lay the foundation to pursue work in the larger Philadelphia metropolitan market.
So I'm assuming, I shouldn't assume, so let me ask the question. When you started trying to get that work, did these institutions kind of welcome you with open arms, or how was that process for you to try to get that work, that business?
It was an interesting transition. As the economy began to recover, the conversation around diversity began to reignite. What at the time, I would say is a fair way to describe it, is that there was a cattle call, a broad outreach to the diverse business community, which most of those institutions didn't have many, if any, diverse business partners, vendors that they worked with. But showing up to take advantage of those opportunities, responding to that invitation, there was, I guess, a certain cautiousness, a certain skepticism that you encountered. So, you would answer the call, and then the opportunities would be slow coming in some instances, or very small, trying to establish a track record. And in some cases, it was a really slow build that began to represent a question for me of the long-term viability of my business.
Mm-hmm. And so, you're still in business, which means that at some point that started to change the perception of Pride, the perception of Craig Williams in terms of being able to do this work. At what point did that happen?
So we're about 7 years into that transition. So I would say we began to get traction in about the third to fourth year of that. And so that's actually what led to the other business that I operate, American Power. As Pride was beginning to start to see work, but not the kind of work that we've been doing for decades for the federal government, the opportunity to get into the supply side of the business was presented to me. And we moved forward. I found a business partner. We identified a company to acquire, rebranded it as American Power, repositioned it for a commercial industrial application. And in that time frame, while we were developing that venture, Pride Enterprises also started to get traction and started to get the kinds of projects that we needed to sustain our capability and grow. And so as it worked out, American Power represented a plan B. And as it stands now, both businesses are growing and thriving.
So, I probably made a little bit of a mistake that I'm going to try to fix now, which is to say that we've been talking about your business. We've been talking about how Pride is kind of going through its growth and development. And now we're talking about how American Power, came on the scene, that was an opportunity for you. But what we have not talked about, because there are a lot of people who are going to be watching this that don't know the slightest about construction, like
Sure.
nothing. And so if we could just paint a picture of, what happens with a commercial construction project, right? Like, how does it happen? When are you brought in? How do you get your work? What do you do when you get your work? Take us through that process.
Well, that too can vary tremendously depending on how you're situated, which market you're operating in. Even within a market segment, there are a variety of different ways that it happens. But just from a general standpoint, most of our history was in the public sector. In the public sector, the vast majority of government spend is done through an advertised process. So there's a website that you can go to and plug in a certain search criteria, and then opportunities present themselves and you look at them and see which ones you want to pursue. It's a public situation. The plans and specs are readily available. If you qualify for the specific criteria and you have the bonding, the resources necessary to participate, then you can bid it pretty much, at your pleasure. And if you're the low bidder, you get the job. If you're in the 8A program or something like that, that's market driven, then you have to do the research, find out who all of the government representatives are, who handle the purchasing, go meet with them, develop a relationship with them. And if they have a confidence in you or have a need, then they'll reach out to you and present an opportunity for you to negotiate with them. In the private sector, it's a mixed bag. If you have clients, institutional clients like Temple and Penn, it's similar to the government procurement, except it's by invitation only. And so they'll have a set of plans and specs that if you've been vetted and accepted as a vendor, you get an invitation. They provide you with those plans and specs, and then you submit a bid for that. And if you're the low bidder or you represent the best value, then you can be hired to do that job. But then there are other ways that opportunities present themselves in the private sector. Corporations, pretty much, they operate like private citizens. So they can do whatever they want. They can negotiate it with you. They can bid it competitively. It's pretty much, whatever they choose, how they want to spend their money, that's how it gets done. But then there's also the development space, where you have large and small scale developers that have identified a project that they want to bring to fruition. And then you may be involved in the very early stages of design and constructability analysis, where you're helping evaluate whether or not this is a viable development. And because you have those relationships and that access, and you've participated in the process at that stage, then you have a very good chance of being the builder, or being on a short list of companies that get an exclusive opportunity to do a project like that. So, I mean, there's a really broad range of ways that a contractor can find opportunity in the various markets.
And so when you're doing a commercial contract, a commercial job, you bid it out. Now, when you bid it out, you're not just making up the numbers in your head. I'm assuming you're going to talk to other people who are going to provide you with the services that will enable you to do the job, correct?
Yes, and I mean, make it up in your head. I mean, that is, I guess, in some ways, at times that can be a fair description. Although we would like to think that we bring expertise to the table, and historical cost data that informs that formulation of a cost assessment. But certainly, at a stage of the process, it depends on what percentage the construction documents are. I mean, in the process of creating plans and specifications, they go through a development process. So early on, it's almost entirely conceptual based on square foot cost information. But at some point, you do bring in the trade professionals to bring a more market sensitive, informed, specified cost assessment. But in the case of a bid, we absolutely enlist the support of the contractor community. We collect quotes from the full range of kinds of construction disciplines in order to formulate our budget to have a competent bid that we can be comfortable with if we win.
Right. So short answer is, in a bid, you're not pulling it out of your head.
Or anywhere else for that matter. And yes. I mean, look, the industry, we rely on the skilled professionals for their expertise. As a general contractor, you're the jack of all trades. You're the quarterback of the situation. We are knowledgeable. We have a strong sense of what the cost should be. But the folks that do that particular trade, they really are the experts. And they're the ones that you have to rely on. And ultimately, you're going to hire them. So if you say it's $10 and you get hired at $10, and then the market says it's $12, you got to find $2. That's just how it is.
Right. So now you're doing American Power as well, which is an electrical supply company. Who are your clients?
The clients for American Power are generally electrical contractors. Many of them are Local 98 union contractors. Some of them are non-union contractors, but we are pursuing the commercial industrial space in the city of Philadelphia. So the vast majority of the clients for American Power are union electricians. Although there are certain instances where a general contractor construction manager will do a direct purchase and then assign that equipment or those materials to the electrical contractor. But that's more atypical. Generally speaking, the electrician is the one who's purchasing from us.
And so how do you how have you gone about kind of getting your name out there? How has that been? Like, what's the process for getting that done?
Well, my partner, Seth Richards, has 20 years of experience working for a variety of other electrical suppliers. So he brought a lot of the relationships with electricians to the table from his experience, but also a unique dynamic of American Power is that me as his partner, operating as a general contractor construction manager, um, I also have relationships with electricians who work on our projects, but I also have relationships with other larger builders who obviously hire electricians all the time. And so Seth and I developed kind of a bottom up, top down marketing strategy where through Pride's relationships with other general contractors, electricians, and our clients, we're able to drive business to American Power. And then American Power, or my partner Seth, works it from the bottom up with the electrical contractors.
So you're competing against other suppliers. How does that work in terms of your prices? Are you all buying from the same wholesalers and you essentially offering the same prices, or how are you competitive in that regard?
We'd like to think we're very competitive. Our value proposition is also service. We're located in West Philadelphia, so we're in striking distance to all the major projects around the city. So that is a factor. There are also economies of scale. There are very large electrical suppliers whose buying power makes it difficult for us to compete. In some instances, diversity can be a bit of an equalizer, right? When there's diversity spend initiatives. Not that folks are prepared to pay a huge premium,
right? But
the opportunity to negotiate and really work through what is the competitive range and can we get there, bringing in, you know, our manufacturers and other wholesalers that we deal with to try to meet the market rate. And so, you know, it's a challenge. I mean, we're still technically a startup. So, you know, being able to throw our weight around is really not an option. We're not that big yet. But we like to think that we're a hard-hitting, aggressive company that can hold our own.
So I have a couple of more questions. We are coming to the end of our time, and I greatly appreciate you, Craig Williams, for coming on to Diversitas to talk about your experience, your history, and what you're doing now. So one question I had is, what would you tell, I mean, you're still a young man, clearly, but despite the fact that you're a young man, what would you tell your younger self if you were starting out in construction?
That's a great question. Don't go into it. No. Be a lawyer. No. You know, trust your instincts. Don't take the shortcuts. You know, the greatest asset that I have is the experience. You know, I started out in the field, you know, working, you know, as a carpenter, as a laborer, and really understanding, you know, what a job site is like and what goes on in the field. And then coming into the office, I did, you know, every job there was up until I became a vice president for my father's company. And so I really laid a strong foundation of understanding the industry and getting a broad exposure and to just stick to it.
So when you are not, this is the last question, when you're not like doing construction stuff, what do you do in your free time? I mean, I know you're an entrepreneur, so free time is like, what's that? But when you eke out some free time, what are you doing with it?
Well, interestingly, you know, before we got on air, you were touching on an area of interest of mine. I actually have a creative streak, always have. I'm actually the author of a book. And
I didn't know that.
So, yeah.
So you put all those words you put out there, and you actually put them in a book.
I don't just run my mouth. Sometimes I actually write them down. And yeah. So I have creative interests. I'm also a family man, and so with a growing daughter, that's where most, if not all, of any spare time I have goes to being involved with her. But where I can, I dabble in some creative pursuits.
Are you a music lover?
Of course, love music.
What's your favorite type of music?
Oh, I don't know if I have a favorite type. I like all great music. There's so many different genres. I mean, I love hip hop. I love jazz. I love rock music and classical music. It depends on the mood. Depends on what's going on. But I like to think that I like the best of it all.
Ladies and gentlemen, a Renaissance man. Fred Bowman. We thank you so much. We thank you so much for coming on today. We greatly appreciate your time with us. And we thank you, audience, for listening or watching our show. We look forward to having the conversation and keeping it going.